Hey guys, we're Team Zulu. We're composed of Mark, Joss, Ronan, and Marika. Here we're looking at the evidence-based pyramid. Today we're focusing on the purple box, titled Cohort Studies. There are two main types of studies, observational and experimental. Cohort studies fall under observational studies, which can be used to study a wider range of exposures. These studies are considered natural experiments. There are three main components, which are etiology, prognosis, and intervention. You want to ask what risk factors are there for developing disease. What factors predict mortality or disability? Is it unethical or unfeasible to conduct an experimental study? This helps determine if an observational study is best.
Now that we've talked about what observational studies are, this diagram illustrates how to determine which study design to use. If you are sampling in regards to exposure or the suspected cause, that is when you would use a cohort study. Cohort comes from the Latin cohors, which means armed force or band. This makes sense since a cohort study refers to a group of people proceeding together in time. You select the exposed and the unexposed for a cohort study. This slide just explains a cohort study design. You have a study population which is non-randomly assigned to either exposed or unexposed. You then follow them in time to see who develops the disease and who does not develop disease. For the classification of variables, we have exposure, the independent variable, the disease or outcome, the dependent variable, and other variables such as confounders, effect modifiers, and explanatory variables. These can all interfere with the exposure-outcome relationship. Something else to consider is inclusion criteria. Who will be in our study? This must be specifically defined before the study begins and remove any subjectivity.
There are already potential sources for assembling the cohort study population. These include occupational cohorts, prepaid health plan members, schools, and military. These allow for ease of identification and follow-up. There are different methods of determining exposure status, such as questionnaires, lab tests, physical measurements, special procedures, existing records.
When selecting groups for a study, things you want to take into consideration are occupational groups, which are exposed and not. You want to look at exposure misclassification in those groups and compare it with an external standard. You also want to take into consideration the healthy worker effect, which is a sort of selection bias that can occur. In addition, you want to consider any confounding factors. You also want to make sure that you select subjects from a defined population. Basic assumptions of a cohort study. The exposed and non-exposed groups are representative samples of a well-defined general population. When defining follow-up, especially in a prospective cohort study, you want to consider how often will the cohort be followed. Will you be able to have continuous surveillance? Will you follow up monthly, yearly, every 3 years? You want to consider what is feasible. You also want to consider how will disease occurrence be counted. This chart indicates the prospective cohort study design. If you establish your study population in 2019, you would then follow them forward in time to see who develops the disease and who does not develop the disease. This chart shows the retrospective cohort study design. You would look today to see who has the disease and who does not have the disease, and then look backwards in time. For the validity of the results, you want to take into consideration external validity and internal validity. External validity is the extent to which the results of a study can be applied to the people not in the study. This basically means you want to see if your study is generalizable or representative of the general population. For internal validity, it's the extent to which the groups are comparable within the study.
There are certain issues that can occur during the interpretation of results. One of these is bias, which is a systematic error in the design, conduct, or analysis of a study that results in a mistaken estimate of an exposure's effect on the risk of disease. Some disadvantages of a cohort study include that they're not helpful for rare diseases, the study can take a long time, it can be expensive, the validity of results affected by loss to follow-up, and the exposure may change over time. Advantages include they're good for rare exposures, examine multiple effects of single exposure, examine temporal relationship between exposure and disease, and allows direct measurement of incidence of disease.
Once we have our results, we consider the analytic approach. We want to calculate the relative risk, which is the incidence in the exposed divided by the incidence in the unexposed. When interpreting the relative risk of disease, if it's equal to 1, that means there's no association. If it's greater than 1, it's a positive association. And if it's less than 1, it is a negative association. This shows other analytic approaches that one can take.
This is just a brief review of what we covered so far. Cohort studies enroll based on exposure. There are prospective and retrospective cohort designs. Incidence can be calculated in cohort studies. Good for rare exposures, bad for rare outcomes. Relative risk, the measure of association calculated. We hope you found this presentation on cohort studies to be interesting. Now here's some fun behind-the-scenes footage of Team Zulu. Das, Ronan, and Marika. Here we're looking at the evidence-based